Welcome back. African countries, like others around the world, are contending with an unprecedented shock, which merits substantial and unconditional financial assistance due to the COVID-19 pandemic. With social distancing, curfew, and lockdown measures bringing many businesses to a halt, the economic costs of COVID-19 are proving to be devastating. In addition, exchange rate depreciations inflate local currency values of foreign currency debt, make debt management and servicing more challenging, a particular threat in Africa, where an estimated one-third of countries are either in or at the high risk of debt distress. Now, to drill down on this, Matt Kinniger, a senior analyst for Sub-Saharan Africa at Dakar Frontier, joins us this afternoon. Good afternoon, Matt. Thanks for joining us. Well, the IMF recently recategorized Kenya's risk of falling into debt distress from moderate to high. What prompted this, and which other markets are at risk?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show. So certainly, yes. In Kenya's case, the IMF has raised its risk of debt distress from moderate to high, and it cited the impact of the coronavirus on the economy and sentiment, especially on public finances. For a good example, Kenya's debt to GDP ratio has increased from about 50% 5 years ago to over 62% this year. So it really is in a much worse position than it was to deal with the pandemic. But Kenya is an example of how governments across sub-Saharan Africa are facing increasing pressures on their to service debts. And this is because of much weaker foreign exchange earnings, declines in currency value. So we've seen quite a lot of currency volatility recently, and this is making it much more expensive for them to honor and service overseas, especially dollar-denominated debts. In terms of the countries that are much more at risk or much more at risk of entering debt distress over the coming months, I will note that Mozambique is already in default and its fiscal position is likely to deteriorate further over the year. But Angola, Zambia, and potentially even Ghana and Cameroon are at more risk. And this is because they have all seen, well, with the exception of Cameroon, they have all seen pretty sharp declines in the value of their currencies in recent months. And they entered the coronavirus pandemic with high debt levels and also quite large budget deficits, and in some cases increasing budget deficits. So these countries really are being squeezed the most in terms of their fiscal position.
But what kinds of measures are lenders such as the multilateral institutions taking to help African governments to weather the current crisis and avoid falling into debt distress?
Yeah, so in the last couple of months, a number of multilateral institutions have been quite quick to respond to the looming worry of increasing risk of debt distress. So, for example, the IMF has been quite active around the region. It has authorized a number of multi-billion-dollar emergency loans for a number of countries. A good example is Nigeria, which has had a $3.4 billion loan approved. Ghana has had a $1 billion loan issued, and also Kenya has had around about $740 million approved as well. The G20 in April agreed to suspend debt payments until the end of the year at least, and the World Bank has also provided some extra financing for countries struggling. So, for example, with the financing of healthcare facilities to help combat the pandemic. So these really will provide a sort of meaningful buffer, reduce the acute stress that governments face in terms of financing their debts, and it will mean that governments will be able to continue to function without having to suspend payments or default on their debts over the coming months.
But multilateral concessional debt is one thing, Matt, but many African countries have also borrowed extensively from the private sector, for instance, by issuing Eurobonds. How will countries cope with meeting the costs when with this debt measure, or when the debt matures, rather?
Yes, so I mean, that is a very important point. So it's not just debt to multilateral institutions. A number of African governments over recent years have issued large amounts of dollar-denominated debt to private sector overseas creditors. And these creditors are much more reluctant to allow for a payment or a debt payment delay or a payment holiday. So these repayments will weigh on many governments for a number of months and well into 2021. So this is a concern for sure. In order to cope, many governments will likely domestically. We've seen this. A very good example is in Mozambique, where after the country defaulted, it turned to local financial institutions, local banks to borrow more. We expect this to happen more in countries before they default. But this will have the impact of squeezing the availability of credit for the private sector in these countries. So this is one way that governments will try to cope. Another is focusing on some sort of fiscal adjustment. We've seen a number of countries, for example, Nigeria, Angola, have been very pragmatic and very quick to adjust their budget plans for 2020 by reducing expenditure and introducing tax increases. So we are expecting tax increases across the region. But major big ticket infrastructure items are probably going to be postponed, and we'll probably see governments making these difficult decisions towards the end of this year and the beginning of 2021.
Senior analyst SSA at Darko Frontier London, Matt Kindiger, thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you.